My name is Jean Said Maqdisi, and this session is entitled Biographies of Political Feminist Figures. I have a very brief introduction. In 1943, a famous women's march took place in Beirut, demanding Lebanese independence from France. This picture used to be on the frontispiece of the national history textbooks. I'm not sure today whether it still is. Does anyone know? Maybe. In 1952, women in this country won the right to vote and to be elected in national elections for parliamentary representations. Today, in 2018, we have four women in the parliament, out of a total of 128. All four of these women owe their seats directly to their family connections. In 2004, the first woman took her place in the national government. And although since then only one government did not boast the presence of a single woman, governments have consistently included a woman minister. This sorry situation has been repeated in the formation of the present government. The place of women in Lebanese public life and the fateful decisions taken by parliament and government is, if not the worst in the Arab world, certainly one of the worst. Yet anyone who visits Lebanon is struck by the high visibility of women in the country. Women are bank managers, principals of schools, deans in universities, presidents of universities. There are women writers, poets, filmmakers, there are publishers and journalists, lawyers and judges, doctors and pharmacists. The labor force includes women in all ranks of economic activities. There's a thriving women's movement in this country. Women have been extremely active in social work, and many women's organizations, including dozens of NGOs, have been fighting for decades for women's rights. As a result of these women's hard work, the place of women has been improved in several labor laws and in criminal and family law, especially those laws dealing with domestic violence. Yet, though better figures can be seen in municipal elections and therefore in municipal governments, in parliament and in the national government, the unacceptable situation of women remains as I have described it. One of the principal themes of women's demands in Lebanon has been the political engagement of women in the country. Lebanon today is coming up to new national elections due to be held in a few months in May. Yet a women's quota in the parliament, the demand for which, talked about and publicly debated for years, has not been written into the new electoral law. Why has there been such a decline, or an apparent decline, since 1943 and even 1952 in the political participation of women? Why have women not been able to achieve the necessary power with which to translate their demands into fair representation and thus into the laws of the land? Are we asking the wrong questions? When I say we, I mean feminists and women, assuming that there are many men feminists as well as women, which I think is a fair assumption. Have we thought and taught and written about the wrong things? Are we making wrong decisions? Maybe we should stop talking and just seize power. Maybe that's what we should do. Will the story of course I'm just joking. I think I'm just joking. I mean, really, oppressed minorities throughout the world rise up in anger. Women are an oppressed majority in almost all the countries of the world, and yet we're still nice and ladylike. Will the story of individual women who have written about and acted in politics help us understand this conundrum? I hope that this afternoon's timely panel will be able to shed some light on this issue. Okay, our first speaker this afternoon is Angela Kahil, sorry. Angela is presently teaching at AUB and the Université Saint-Esprit in Kaslik, and is a visiting professor also at Erfurt University in Germany. Her fields are history, political science, geopolitics, and international relations, and she specializes in contemporary Middle Eastern studies. She graduated with a BA from the USJ, that is the University Saint-Joseph in Beirut, and the Panthéon Sorbonne with an MA, and Assas University in Paris with another MA, yes. And another MA from the USG also.
Yes.
So we have a world champion, I think. She's presently a PhD candidate in Paris in the INALCO, which is the Institut National
des Langues Orientales.
Des Langues Orientales, working on diplomacy and feminism in the Arab world and Lebanon. The title of her talk is Angela Jourda Khoury, A Historical Perspective of Political Feminism in Lebanon. I'm going to give each of the speakers this afternoon 15 minutes, which their 15 minutes will be up when they hear a bell. But I will not be that cruel, but we have to keep our time. Okay. So please start, Angela.
So hello, everybody. First of all, I want to explain the choice of my topic. Actually, it's my PhD title, thesis title, and indeed, so I have 3 masters, and I'm now finishing my PhD because for a long time, I thought about a real topic which could really involve me in at least 3 years of research, and not being annoyed by it or fed up with it after 3 years. So Angela Jourda Khoury is one of the Lebanese, is the first diplomat in Lebanon. This is how we introduce her. And she was part of the Lebanese delegation to the UN in 1945. And what we know about this delegation is that Charles Malik, who will be the first Lebanese ambassador to the USA, he is actually monopolizing the scene, the diplomatic scene. We always talk about Charles Malik's perspective on Lebanese foreign policy, how he influenced Lebanese decisions in the world, and we never talk about her. She is the only woman in this delegation. She was also the influencer. And when I was in the USA as a Fulbright scholar last summer, I was influenced by my mentor, who was Paul Miller, and he is the director of the Clements Center at UT Austin. And they have an approach in working on biographies and trying to rewrite history through great figures in the world. And this is why I chose this figure. So why not to rewrite the Lebanese foreign policy through a feminine figure, and to see how she really influenced decision making, and even she is the one who decides what Charles Malik is known for. So, she has influenced history since the late 30s. So this is her here. So if you want to see her face. So what is the context? So according to me, actually, she has rise as a feminine figure in a context where paternalism was in crisis. And this is interesting to think about today, but this is what Jean was talking. So we were in a period where women had all every chance, every opportunity to rise as public figures. So the paternalism in crisis, it has been analyzed by Elizabeth Thompson, and she said indeed colonialism has brought a new approach, a new social approach in the territory, in the colonies, and especially in the territories under the mandate, so Lebanon, Syria, and it was a questioning of patriarchy and also the dominance of men in the public sphere. So I'm not going to talk a bit about this. So and especially what was criticized was what Saad Joseph called political feminism. So feminism not only in the family as a structure, but also as a microcosm of the nation. So feminism has introduced sectarism and this power. The inheritance of power actually in Lebanon and dominated by men. So this is this context in the 30s. We know that we talk about a feminist nahda in Lebanon. The women نساء العشرينات, so the women of the 20s. So they have really allowed to make a great step actually to bring women to the public sphere through NGOs or associations to promote social welfare in Lebanon and well in the Arab world in general. So this is the context, and the other one. So the definition of politicalism. I'm going to go back. The second context is, of course, co-education in universities. And as Dean Nadia Sheikh said this morning, AUB was one of the pioneer institutions that allowed co-education. But what she didn't say is that not only co-education, bringing women to education, but comparatively to other institutions, AUB had a mission. And this mission was not only to educate women, but what it's called making women, and making women public figures. And we can read in the documents that the mission was to allow women to have a national or an international career. So not only to get knowledge. To promote in their family or in their social environment, but also to have careers. And for example, we compared to Zahrat al-Ahsan in Lebanon, which was also an important institution that brought co-education, but the mission was only to permit to women to have a job and to be themselves in or to accomplish themselves, but only on a social aspect, not on a political aspect. So co-education indeed made AUB so a pioneer institution, and as we can read, so 19 AUB alumni were part of the UN delegations in 1945, and they come from different countries from the Arab world, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, even Ethiopia. I forgot Ethiopia. And Angela Jabdahouri is the only woman among the 19 AUB alumni. So this context is interesting. And Angela Jabdahouri is an AUB alumni. Actually, sorry, there's just a mistake on the picture. She's the girl just next to this one. So this is her, and here we have the graduate students in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and we can notice that there are very few women there, but all of them actually played important roles in politics, in the world. So who was she? So she was first of all important figure at AUB. So she was a student in AUB since her childhood. So she was at the American School for Girls, American Junior College for Women. She got her BA in 1937 and her MA in 1938, and she wrote her thesis, her MA sociology thesis, and it has been considered as a real pioneer work in sociology by American scholars, and it has been published in Washington, D.C. She also was very active as an AUB student in sport teams. Also, she organized trips for girls to be part of the international trips, etc. And she also taught at AUB. So she is the first woman to reach this position. So she taught sociology and psychology in AUB, and also she held different administrative positions there at AUB. And afterwards, she kept on tightening this relation with AUB while she was in DC, and since 1945. And she stayed, after being retired from the diplomatic service, she stayed in the US, and she kept bringing or enhancing AUB's role to her. So we have here some quotes about how she thanks AUB for giving her all this education. And she said, for example, that AUB allowed her to have civic responsibility, to be really prepared for advanced academic training. And she said, even without AUB, I wouldn't have been able to serve my people at the national or international level, except in a minor role. So it was a fundamental basement for her to. So she served Lebanon. Even before being a diplomat. So, for example, we have resources, material that tell us that she worked in the resistance in the radio polls for Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine in 1943. So she played a role in liberating Lebanon during the Second World War, and here she met Charles Malik, and Charles Malik will be her mentor and her friend, and even the godfather of her children. He told her, well, come and be part of the delegation, and she accepted it. And we have a letter from the president of AUB at that time saying that it was with regret that we will let her go, because she is a very exceptional woman. But if she could do exceptional things for Lebanon, so let it be, and to join the diplomatic service. So, she wasn't ambassador. She was secretary of the legations in Lebanon. But she has been for 1 year, less than 1 year, consul in New York. But in DC, she was a secretary, and she has her ascension was very great, because she was third secretary, and then at the end of her career, she was first secretary of the embassy. But her role is very important because, well, the USA has recognized Lebanon, of course, in 1943, so since its independence. But we have an embassy in DC in 1952. So she was the one who worked in the administration to make it real, to make it concrete. And this embassy, in 1952, actually the first ambassador will be Charles Malik at that time. So they both played a very important role in preparing this embassy, which will tighten the US-Lebanese relations. And yes, so. Yeah, another thing, also for serving Lebanon, and to see her humanity, she wanted to get married. And I read a letter she sent to Charles Malik in 1947, telling him, please let the Foreign Office in Lebanon allow me to get married. First, because women diplomats are not allowed to be married. And the second reason is that her husband was Palestinian, or he was American, from Palestinian origins, and in that time, in 1947, it was very, very a sensitive topic. So she really wanted to be a woman, to be married, to raise a family, but also to keep her job as a diplomat. And yes, we're gonna finish. So this letter was very, very touching, and finally, well, of course, she got married and she got children, and those children have a very beautiful career afterwards in the US. And serving Lebanon, the last thing here in this idea, in 1958, I don't know if you know the history of Lebanon, but we were in a situation where civil war was very close because Lebanon was divided in two ideologies. Well, Shamronism, which is more an Atlantism to tighten relations with the US, and the Nasserism, which is completely the opposite. And at that time, Lebanon had to make a choice whether it accepts the Eisenhower Doctrine or no. And Shamroun was very close to sign actually the pact, the Baghdad Pact with the US, and it was a context of a pre-civil war situation. And there I have interviewed her son, Philippe Houre, and about the situation. And he told me that Charles Melik and her, they were not in the embassy to manage the situation. They were at their home, at their, in Angela Jordahouri home. And she was the one with her personal telephone, not the embassy one, because it was yes, no. And she was the one who dissuaded the president of Lebanon, Camille Shamroun, to resign and not to let Lebanon fall into this crisis. And indeed, in Charles Melik documents, we see that he didn't do anything, and she was the one who really managed the situation. So, just another thing. So another idea about her identity. So she was a feminist, and she was also the rapporteur in the UN. In the UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1946, and every time she has been nominated as rapporteur, the American news wrote it. So it was also something interesting. So in this Commission of Human Rights, she wanted, or of course, equal rights for men and women, equal right to vote. So she defended she wanted the Lebanese to also to vote. So we obtained the right to vote in 1952. But she also fought because in 1952 the text allowed only women, literate women, to vote, and she fought a lot to change the text and to allow all women to get this right to vote. And Shamroun abrogated the law and signed a decree thanks to her. And she was formally against polygamy, and this is interesting for her fight for the Arab world, because she really wanted to not to modernize or to westernize the society, but to fight for something more equal. So this is her in the commission. Sorry, here, and and I think so. So just in word politics, from a political point of view, she is able to represent diplomatically her country. She is there for conflict resolution. She is an influencer. So this is anachronic at that time, but she is an influencer. And of course, she's a very great teacher, because after resigning in 1966, she kept on teaching international relations in very famous university. And so for our main topic, the conclusion is, feminism is not in crisis. Feminism is rooted in history, and we have to exploit that and to bring it back to the public, because they don't know about women figures in the Arab world. And the negative thing,
I think it's time to stop. Thank you.
But the negative thing is social determinism, because she comes from already a very important family in Lebanon. Her father was the dean of the chair of math at AUB. He has also found a star, Al-Kulliya, and he gave its name to a star. So is it really feminism, social determinism, national feminism? And maybe national feminism is this is why feminism is not matching, because it's no more linked to nationalism. And
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Sorry for taking that.
Our next speaker is Yasmin Shafi'i. Get it right?
Yes.
Yasmin is working towards her PhD in Arab and Middle Eastern history at the AUB. Her PhD proposal focuses on the history of mental illness in Egypt. That sounds fascinating. After receiving her BA and MA in International Relations from the AUC, she spent 15 years working in various UN agencies. Her research projects and interests include women's history, Arab feminism, the Egyptian feminist movement, women in the Arab press, and the histories of minorities in Alexandria. Thank you, Yasmin. You'll also get a ring, and since you're close to me, you'll be able to turn it off.
So, no, I'm really worried about time. But anyways, let me start by saying that this study is going to explore, that this study is going to explore the use of literary text as vital historical sources of female voices and ultimately of gender constructs. I do this by focusing on the literary works of two leading Arab women writers, Aisha Taimur, or Aisha Taimuriya, and Malak Hifni Nasif. The study will highlight how these literary works were powerful modes of self-expression through which these women discussed and debated both women's and national issues. These works essentially offered women a space for activism in place of what is referred to as the male-dominated public sphere. Both Taimur and Nasif used writing as a vehicle through which they were able to disseminate early feminist thought to a large readership. Gender constructs were thus taking place in the literature of these Arab female writers in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, just as male intellectuals were dominating the public sphere at the time. Female literature is relevant primarily because it provides an alternative interpretation of the role of women in the public domain, and because it provides the feminist discourse with significant female images and methods of portrayal. I argue that the work of these women illustrates the need to broaden our definition of activism, moving beyond the political leaders of women's organizations and focusing equally on the daily actions, writings, and lives of women, what we refer to today as the lived realities of these women. Before women became active in the political realm, they were already challenging gender boundaries within their own homes and communities. Unfortunately, these activities outside the political realm have often been considered either marginal or auxiliary. Failing to make their way into traditional historical writing. And it's within this non-political realm that the study of women's literature can make a major contribution to the master narratives of history, narratives in which male-dominated and institutional history are paramount. Second, I question I argue that what is needed is a production of new feminist knowledge and question this so-called public-private dichotomy, which is one I think we really need to move beyond. Mm-hmm. And finally, I look at the primacy of religion in the works of Taimur and Nasif, as well as the lived realities of Egyptian women today, arguing that a relevant feminist movement must use beyond the binaries of secular and Islamic feminisms, and into a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the role religion comes to play in the lives of the women it claims to represent. So I'm not going to go through the literature review because of time constraints, but basically I build on the work on the lives of these two women done by May Zieda herself, as well as Joseph Zidane and Hoda Sadda. In terms of looking at literary texts as historical texts, there's a considerable body of writing, much of it by women, which was silenced or previously ignored in previous generations. This has created what we call blind spots. These previously ignored literary texts offer narratives which are valuable socio-historical documents in terms of what they reveal about women's lives and work, as well as early feminist thought, before the word feminism and feminists actually developed into our lexicon. A study of the histories of women reveals this bias towards both the political and institutional history, focusing on its leaders, the leaders of the Egyptian nationalist movement, such as the women like Durriya Shafi, etc. Although this institutional history and the political activities it represents is important, it's only a partial picture. A full picture undoubtedly includes the lifestyles, activities, and thoughts of this women, and this is where female literature comes in. Looking specifically at the gender contrast in the works of Aisha Taimur and Malak Hifni Nasif, as windows into a particular historical moment, the works of both Taimur and Nasif reveal much about this period in Egyptian history, as well as the author's own consciousness of their self and their identity. Both women lived their fiction. In other words, their life stories are directly connected to the fictional narratives and the poetry that they constructed during this period. Understanding their representations of male and female roles and how they were constructed in these texts, it's significant because it doesn't always only reveal the historical and the cultural context in Egypt at the time, but also about how women perceived themselves. So just as in the writings of their male counterparts, Taimur and Nasif's texts were part of a historical process in which gender roles came at the heart of national debates. We heard Dr. Sada today talking about the male intellectuals and how women's rights were kind of pitted against the nation itself, and they were more than about women themselves, but were about the modernity and the nation. Women's education was seen as part of the reasons why the nation could either advance or could be backward. So it was about more than women themselves. For the texts written by Taimur and Nasif reveal a different thing. Women personalized and internalized the struggle. They talked about these issues, the same issues that men discussed, education and seclusion, as it related to them personally and not so much as it related to the nation. And this was a key difference. It became a kind of a key marker of identity. Aisha Taimur. She was born in 1840 in Cairo, the daughter of a Kurdish official in the Khedive government, Ismail Pasha Taimur, and a Circassian concubine. She was interested in acquiring education, and it was her father who supported her desires. Her mother wanted her to get married. And this is actually a recurrent theme. We see this with Aisha Taimur, we see this with Malak Hafni Nasif, and with a number of other Egyptian and Lebanese female activists, where the father is the one that kind of drives this education forward. So it's the men in the lives of these women. I mean, this is just an aside that I thought was relevant to note. She was schooled in the literary arts, developing an early love and talent in literature and poetry. And in 1884, she married Muhammad Tawfiq al-Islambuli. Her marriage was miserable. She was not happy. Marital discontent was a central theme in her literature. Her husband died in 1885, and that's when she felt free to begin her writing career, returning to Cairo, publishing poems and articles. She wrote poems in 3 languages, Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. Actually, as well as Turkish. Her diverse poetry covered topics as love, elegies, religion, and social commentaries. Her major works included the fictional نتائج الأحوال في الأقوال والأفعال, The Results of Circumstances in Words and Deeds in 1887, مرآة التعامل في الأمور, Reflecting Mirror on Some Matters in 1892, and poetry حلية الطراز in 1885, and the Turkish Shakufa. She wrote poetry in Persian, but she destroyed these poems after she spent years mourning the death of her eldest daughter, who died at the age of 18. Her refusal of domesticity and female seclusion and the alternative emphasis on women's education permeated much of her literature. In the introduction to her fictional work, نتائج الأحوال, in 1887, she says, "I have suffered in this cave of isolation. Compassion for all women who have encountered what I have encountered and who have been struck by the same blows has led me to fashion a tale that would distract them from their cares when thoughts crowd in and would entertain them, drawing them far from the grief they feel." So she contrasts education against seclusion and ignorance, which plagued her and which she referred to regularly in her poetry. In an article in 1889 in Al-Adab, she blames male authorities for keeping girls uneducated, preferring to keep them secluded and superficial, saying, "O men of our homelands, O you who control our affairs, why have you left women behind?" Much of what we know about her, in fact, comes from the biography written by May Ziada. According to Ziada, much to Taimur's mother's disappointment, she was interested in literacy rather than needlework. And when she came up with the poem Tahiyat al-Tiraz, this was referring to her mother's emphasis on embroidery or tatriz. And it kind of reflects the tension she had between wanting to please her mother and be this domestic mother and wife, and between wanting to please her father and get an education. Her poetry reflected social and political events. She devoted a great deal of it to political issues, criticizing the Arabi revolt in 82, accusing the rebels of being ungrateful and insane heretics. She was known for her moving elegies. She was known for her love poetry, and this is interesting. She wrote as if her poetry was written by a man, and Ziada believes that this is partly due to the fact that female expression of emotion was not regularly accepted by society at the time. So Taimur's work reflects the major difference between women's literature and between that which published by men. Let me move on to نتائج الأحوال. This is the fictional text in which she blames the backwardness in Egyptian society not on the status of its women, as the male intellectuals tended to do, but on the corrupting practices of government in need of reform. She challenges the dominant male narrative, but she rejects female seclusion in this fictional work, which comes 10 years, a decade before it was referred to by Amile Amin, who is commonly believed to be one of the vanguards of this discussion against female seclusion and polygamy. She reflects on her inability to join the intellectual discussions of learning men, and here we see this quote from saying, "How my lids overflowed with tears because I was deprived of harvesting the fruits of their beneficial learning." In the same text, she engages readers in a story about a misguided prince who attempts to regain his throne through a series of adventures of events, and this is very interesting. What's remarkable, I think, about this story is that it's a story within a story, but what's remarkable about it is representations of men and women in this story. So what Taimur does is she describes the prince, Mamdouh, and the princess Buran as follows, quote, "Buran, the daughter of the king, is famous for her clarity of thought, intelligence, and proper management, while it is known to us how graceful and handsome he is. So once he is captured by her love, and she by his, he will follow her orders. The wife is characterized in terms of thought, intelligence, and skill, and the prince, the husband, is characterized as graceful and handsome." Thereby revising what was at the time typical masculine and feminist characteristics. We see this reversal of gender roles as quite remarkable at this time. This is 1887. This is a recurrent theme, and we see similar concepts in Mir'at al-Ta'amul fil Umur. It is here that one realizes that Taimur was among the first to discuss the concept of Qawama. And I think this was kind of striking, which refers to male guardianship over women in the Islamic legal tradition. So in this work, my personal favorite, she presents the story of a lion who was too lazy and cowardly to go hunting, ordering his lioness to go and hunt instead of him and to bring back food. The lioness initially follows his order, goes back and comes back with the prey. This continues for some time. After a while, she gets tired of this, gets the best of the prey, and gives the lion leftovers. He gets extremely frustrated and demands that she comes back and gives him the best of the prey. She responds, "That was the way things went when you were yourself and I was myself. But now the situation is reversed. So I became you and you became me. You now get what you used to give me and I get what you used to have." To completely understand the significance of this story, and it's important to go back to the context. 1892, Egypt. What comes across clearly in her perception of gender roles is that they're not merely biological. They're socially constructed and thus reversible. A rather revolutionary statement for a woman who lived in a time characterized by female seclusion. Let me just kind of stop at this moment and move on to something I found a couple of days ago that reminded me of this gender role reversal. It is something that a Lebanese artist came up with last week, and it is this. It's entitled "In a Parallel Universe," and this Lebanese artist called Eli Rizallah contrasted 1950s advertisements versus the 2018 gender role reversal that he decided to do. This was very controversial today, last week, in 2018. And it kind of enables us to look at these and see what Aisha Taimur was doing over 100 years ago and see the difference in this context, this gender role reversal. So this was one, this was the other one. Kind of putting women in men's roles and putting men in women's roles. Now let me go back and move to Malak Hifni Nasif quickly because I've got a couple of minutes. She was born in Cairo in 1986 to a middle-class family. Her father was a lawyer, again, who encouraged her to be educated. She taught for a few years until she married Abdel Sattar Pasha in 1907, moving with him to Fayoum. And it was there that she was shocked to find that he was already married to his cousin and that they had a daughter whom she was expected to tutor. This led her to write about the status of women in Egypt, becoming a strong advocate of women's rights within marriage and speaking out against polygamy. She stayed with him for 11 years until she died in 1918 at the young age of 32. She articulated one of the founding discourses of feminism that emerged in Egypt during the early 20th century. She began publishing her work in Al Jarida, the major newspaper of the Ummah Party. In the early 1900s, many elite women began using unveiling, publicly removing their face veil as a symbol of feminism, writers like Amile Amin and women like Huda Sha'rawi unveiled as symbols of progress towards a more European, more liberated world for women. She opposed unveiling and didn't believe it should be used in this way, arguing that the veil was part of the culture for a long time and that banning it would be too abrupt a change. When asked how she felt about women wearing the veil, she replied, "Educate women and let them make their choice." She wrote extensively about marital rights of women in Egypt, about education reform, calling for more Egyptian control over the public education system and the inclusion of religion and history. In 1909, she published speeches and essays entitled An-Nisa'iyat, or Feminist Pieces, examining the challenges and potentials for women as they entered international life. This was her own alternative feminist voice, which was very unique because it combined westernization with Islam and traditionalism, claiming that only a combination of the two would move women in the right direction. And it is here that she says, meant to say to us categorically, you women have been created for the house and we've been created to be breadwinners. Is this a God-given dictate? Her emphasis on Islam as a key marker of her own identity as an Egyptian woman predates the central role that Islam would come into play within the feminist discourse in the late 20th century. Religion was a dominant feature in her work and in her writings. Now, to conclude, I'd like to leave you with three key takeaways from my study on these literary texts, and to kind of see how relevant it is to a movement and to a feminism in crisis. First, the examination of their work shows that the Egyptian tradition in which female intellectuals battled patriarchal norms existing long before it was acknowledged in traditional historical accounts. In other words, long before the word feminism existed, these women were producing what can be called a feminist discourse in their poetry and prose. Their literary works ultimately illustrate the particular way in which they used poetry and fiction to enter the public realm, reaching to a wider base of local and Arab leaders. Second, a second feature of this is how it was framed within of the feminist discourse, how it was framed between several sets of binaries, one of which is the private and versus the public sphere. While this conference focuses on gender in the Arab public sphere, asserting that the Arab public sphere characterized by patriarchal logic. Now, this is true, but the same can be said of the public sphere, the private sphere as well. In fact, whereas many Arab countries have made progress and increased inclusion of women in government and institutions, personal status laws governing the family in the private sphere continue to lag behind, which is why I hope to challenge this public-private dichotomy, hoping instead to change the discussion from one focusing on the so-called public sphere to one focusing on the advancement of women's rights and inclusion at home and in the workplace. It is constructed an ideological binary, and let me quote Marnia Lazrek's assertion here that silence as the absence of public voice is not synonymous with the absence of talk and action. It is one, and this is one that I think should be taken to heart by feminists and historians. And finally, Islamic feminism versus secular feminism, which is a repeated theme in this conference. These dichotomies, I believe, ultimately mask the real struggle between patriarchal and egalitarian narratives. Ideological dichotomies between what is secular and what is Islamic are often misleading and arbitrary. There are many women who do not identify as either, many women who adopt religion as a key marker of identity but don't identify as Islamic feminists. And the current battle, I think, for feminists isn't so much in the infighting between secularists and Islamists. It's a battle for representation and relevance, and one which I think, and battle between feminists and state power, and one in which religion plays a very central role. And I think if feminism and feminist movements are to remain relevant, they need to take this role into account. The final sentence I want to say is this. Perhaps Taimur and Nassif are central to the construction of a new narrative in which women can be both Muslim and independent and feminist. It doesn't have to be an oxymoron. If we can imagine the lives of women like Taimur and Nassif through the writing, many women today can reimagine the existence of Islam and feminism in a way that creates platform for their voices, research, and knowledge projection. Feminism may be in crisis, but perhaps the state of crisis is endemic to a feminist movement characterized by an external struggle against patriarchy, an internal struggle for the redefinition of identity. In other words, perhaps there can be no feminism without crisis. Thank you.
I see that my phone has put the fear of God into the panelists. Where am I?
No.
Our third and final speaker is Sarah Murad, assistant professor of media studies in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies at AUB, and the coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies Initiative at AUB. She works at the intersection of media and cultural studies, feminist theory, and queer studies. Her current research on the politics of difference in post-war Lebanon explores identity formation, cultural production, and collective action in feminist and queer circles in Beirut. Sarah's BA from the AUB and her PhD in communication earned her BA in political science at AUB and her PhD in communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Her talk is titled Mothering Feminist Thought. 15 minutes, Sarah.
Yeah. So I'm going to be also talking about a literary text, Ethel Adnan's 1981 essay, Growing Up to Be a Woman Writer in Lebanon. My encounter with feminist writing, as with most political thought, happened in a foreign language. I learned how to conceptualize the world in French and English. Arabic was a language I learned, but not a language I learned with. As a graduate student, a foreign graduate student in the United States, I was writing a PhD dissertation on sexual norms and deviance in post-war Lebanon. In my research, I came across the writings of what we now refer to as second-wave feminism in the United States. The dictum, the personal is political, was basically the locus around which most of this writing has been articulated. And it provided me with a new matrix to understand myself and the world around me. But it also kindled a desire to contend with the paths by which one comes to be a woman and a writer. I came to Ethel Adnan by coincidence. I stumbled upon her essay, Growing Up to Be a Woman Writer in Lebanon, when I was finishing my dissertation in Philadelphia. Written in 1981, the essay chronicles Adnan's coming of age as an unconventional woman. For me, the essay is also about Adnan's mother and exile. By the end of the essay, we know that her departure to Paris, where she studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, was a decisive moment in her constitution as a writer, but also her emancipation as a woman. This was an alienation from home and language that would mark Adnan's work, and which would eventually make present for me, when I read the essay, my own sense of dislocation. I had been living and studying in the US for 5 years, and my physical and psychic distance from Beirut had been increasing. I was writing about sexual politics in Lebanon, but I had grown distant from my own memories of life here, from everyday life. I would regularly Skype with my mother, before WhatsApp came to be and before long conversations gave way to everyday chatter, and remember how hearing the evening newscast in the background of her living room gave me a comforting sense of familiarity, but also of alienation. My mother wished for me a life outside, where the future she believed was imaginable, possible, and secure. She never pushed me to leave, nor to return. She concealed her desire at each turn, letting me be. So it was perhaps Adnan's mother that drew me first to the text that I'm speaking about today. She appears as a paranoid figure, policing her daughter's behavior, embodying for Adnan a whole culture's scrutiny. But she is also, I believe, a towering figure in this text, because even if not explicitly acknowledged, she embodies the maternal bond with home and language that Adnan wrestles with throughout her life's work. The unnamed mother stands in the way of the daughter's intellectual aspirations and her personal ambitions, feeling as she was that her daughter was slipping away from her grip towards a universe unknown to her. This universe was French, and it was to France that years later her daughter would eventually leave to continue her education. But France had found its way to her daughter long before this departure, and this encounter first manifested itself through the nuns of the French Catholic Church here in Beirut, who were the custodians of the Mission Civilisatrice in 1930s Lebanon. And it was through this mission that the French sought to uplift indigenous populations with the spread and promotion of the French language. So upon establishing their official mandate in Syria and Lebanon, the French expanded the already existing French schools in the country and established new ones. They imposed a system of education in total conformity with its counterpart in France, an education, Adnan notes, and I'm quoting, which had nothing to do with the history and the geography of the children involved. Reflecting on her language education during these formative years, Adnan remembers how she started speaking French upon starting school at age 5, and then only French, as Arabic was forbidden at school. So, Adnan writes, I grew up thinking that the world was French, and that everything that mattered, that was in books, or had authority, did not concern our environment. This, she concludes, is what is called alienation. Eventually, Greek and Turkish, which she also usually spoke with her mother at home, her Greek mother, disappeared. And so the maternal bond as it was cracking. I was also schooled in French, but in an American institution. In my childhood, I wrote poems and short stories in Arabic and French. By the time I reached secondary school, French had become my primary language for thinking and writing. In middle school, and upon the addition of English to our curriculum, I gradually started shifting to English in my personal diary writing. English was easier to control. It was increasingly the language of the culture I consumed on a daily basis. I was seduced by its simplicity. As a teenager, I took it up as a preferred language of self-expression. It had a subversive edge to it. French had now been associated with classical literature and philosophy, so English was the language of love letters and personal reflections. When I started college in an American missionary institution, Arabic and French disappeared. English became the language of my mind and hardwire of my expressive capacities. Like Adnan, I found immense pleasure in mastering a new language and acquiring a new vocabulary. And like her, I learned a language my mother did not speak. Did she also feel me slipping towards another place? I was certainly drifting to unfamiliar territories, but when the time and decision came to actually leave, she let go without struggle. Quote, studying in a language basically foreign to my parents created a distance between us. I was engaging myself in territories alien to them, and I was being estranged. I felt more and more different, with frames of reference they could not share. I was becoming a foreigner in my own house, end quote. Mastering the colonizer's language, for Adnan, secured an education, followed by a first job as a teacher of French literature in Al Ahliya School for Girls, and eventually a scholarship to study philosophy at the Sorbonne in 1949. When she started expressing her desire to move to France, Paris came to embody for her mother, quote, hell itself, the capital of white female slavery, the chaos in which children who have left home disappear forever, end quote. And when she finally told her mother that her professor here wanted to send her on a scholarship to France, the mother accused the teacher of being an immoral man, quote, stirring us up and separating us from our homes. And she threatened to blow up the school. We obviously lived in irreconcilable worlds, Adnan concludes. A little girl, she writes, was a daughter, a schoolgirl, and a future wife. She was never considered as an autonomous being whose life could turn out to be something other than what was considered to be the social norm. These norms dictated marriage as the ultimate destiny of young women. And the daughter's budding desire to become an engineer and her later quest to get a university degree in literature were deemed to be immoral by her mother. And when she professed her disinterest in getting married, she was accused of preferring to be adventurous and irresponsible, and was often made to understand that she was in danger of losing her mind. In this regard, Adnan's essay brings out some familiar tropes around insubordinate women: immorality, narcissism, and mental illness. But more than that, the essay is about an undutiful daughter whose path had deviated from all that was familiar by way of writing and of mastering a language. To grow up a woman writer in Lebanon for Adnan is to feel alienated from the familiar. So learning French ruptured her bond with her mother, marking a decisive moment of emancipation from maternal authority. And she recalls that it was by watching French and American movies and by also writing that she found an escape from the constant and unflinching gaze of her overly protective mother. But it would be a mistake to cast the mother as the anti-feminist prude holding her back. We learn from the text that the Greek Orthodox woman was shunned by her family and community for marrying a Muslim Syrian man, Adnan's father. She too was estranged from her world, from what was familiar, and bore the cost of her choices, alienation. Also alienation from her language. As a Greek woman, she had to speak Turkish in her land of exile. Her child, Adnan, spoke a foreign language, French, at home. So the search for a mother tongue in Adnan's writing is futile. Hers is always a bilingual existence, or an existence between languages. So Adnan's learning of French and loss of Arabic exemplifies the process described by post-colonial scholar Ray Chow, in which to learn is simultaneously to alienate or estrange from oneself what is closest to one, and which should be recognized, she argues, as the condition to the post-colonial scene of languaging. Alienation for both Adnan and Chow is produced and felt in language. Colonial education displaced local languages deemed inferior or irrelevant, creating a sense of alienation from the mother and from the home. But it also secured for Adnan a scholarship to complete her education and access to the as yet unlikely and unfamiliar. For American feminist writer Adrienne Rich, to be a female human being trying to fulfill traditional female functions in a traditional way is in direct conflict with the subversive function of the imagination. To be a woman writer, Adnan suggests, is to steer from the traditional way, from the past as handed down to us, and therefore to enter into conflict with our mothers. As a child, I liked to play a role-playing game with my mother in the swimming pool. She would play the child and I the mother, carrying her, weightless as she was in water, and indulging her juvenile tantrums. In this inverted world, I was the mother, and I relished these moments of mothering, which remain vivid memories today. And they return to me through Adnan's essay. So growing up to be a woman writer, it seems to me, is also about growing against and through our mothers, the non-writers. Whose story are we trying to capture in our feminist writing? As we write, whose experience gets told, and whose perspective do we see the world through? Do we write as daughters or as mothers? The focus on motherly and daughterly relations that I'm moving closer to should not be mistaken for a call to center biological ties of kinship as grounds for feminist thought. Rather, it is an invitation to consider a mode of female sociality that shapes our sense of who we are and how we see and interact with the world as women. But it also comes from a need to find the ghosts that haunt the woman writer's text. My mother child in the swimming pool, the power of her imagination. So if the past is to be remembered, those who came before us, who they were and how they lived, shape us in the present. How do we mother feminist thought that is very organic, local, and grounded? How do we give it a form, cultivate, and nurture it? How do we produce ourselves in the texts that we write? All of ourselves. How do we produce the presences and absences that shaped our thought, our writing, and the very language in which this unfolds? So Adnan's text for me is not only a piece of biography that I've come to be attached to, and not only a conduit for my own thoughts about the craft of writing and the experience of womanhood, it is also a motherly text, where I can claim Adnan as a maternal figure, her memory and her writing as a scaffolding for mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You even didn't get to the ringing of the clock, which is going to happen any second. So I'll ask my neighbor to turn it off when it does. We have 15 minutes left for questions, comments, and so on. And I would like to ask you, if you have a comment or a question, to first of all introduce yourself. Second of all, address it to one of the three speakers, if possible, if you want to. And third of all, please, and above all, be brief. We don't want to hear long essays, and we don't want to hear PhD questions.
No questions. All right, let's go.
Anybody? Yes, good.
It's not an easy topic to ask questions.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, especially for the last presentation that I thought was beautiful and eloquent. And I think the most beautiful sentence you said was, Arabic is the language I learned rather than the language I learned with, which is particularly my question for the first presentation. I think if we come to agree that feminism is a kind of liberation, intellectual and social liberation movement, I do not really understand why we take individualism or we take biographies as an outlet to rewrite our history, and we assume that if it's a feminist interpretation of what happened because it happened to a woman, because I don't assume that all women are feminists at the end of the day. So what I did not understand is that why are we targeting the elite class in the process of talking about a very revolutionary anti-authoritarian movement, which is feminism. So this is what I really do not understand. And just one more comment. So talking about public figures, especially AUB, and this is something that has been intimidating me since the morning, so I really have to say it, which is we always talk about how AUB emancipated our Arab women. Although 1920s...
Not all of us do that.
Yeah, unfortunately. So it was good to bring it up then, because since the morning I heard two interventions that were talking about how AUB was the initiator of this emancipation, which is utterly wrong, because since the 1920s we are studying individuals, as you have said, biographies, but we're not studying the ideological context of it all.
Okay, I think I really have to stop you, because otherwise, next time give your own paper. Okay, anyone else? And please let me reiterate my request for brevity. We really have to be brief in our remarks and questions, because otherwise I will cut you off.
Sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
have a question for Dr. Murad. I was wondering, you mentioned language and also a sense of alienation, particularly from the family. And I'm wondering if you see like this sense of alienation as well as like this becoming kind of a dissident or a writer as necessarily like having to exist at the same time, like the alienation perhaps not being possible without the other, or if that is specific kind of to the conditions of either the past moment or the present moment.
Thank you. We'll give. Would you rather answer right away, or wait? We'll collect them for.
We can collect more.
We'll collect
more
them.
questions.
Okay, 2 or 3 more questions, please,
If there
depending on how brief you can be. This one.
Thank you very much for this panel. I have a question for Dr. Murad. I wonder whether you can comment on this kind of coup de théâtre you do at the very end, where you actually reverse the source of theory from, and here we see the motherly becoming a source of theorization. I'm wondering whether, if you can think more about that and how we're kind of reversing the the genealogy of theorization in this sense. Thank you.
Okay. Another question?
We can answer.
Yes.
My name is Aisha Rifai.
You get a microphone.
My name is Aisha Rifai from Palestine. First, all the speakers, an apology because I came last night after midnight and I was kind of missing the point every now and then, so my apologies first because I'm super tired. But anyways, I found what you presented extremely interesting. But I would like to know, I was thinking, what's next? I mean, we have looked into the history, what you talked about amazing, especially first speaker. I was impressed really about what you've done with this kind of very important work. And again,
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, me. So, okay, great. This is important. This is valuable. This is so interesting. My question, how we in the feminist movement can take this further and build on it for the younger generation?
Okay. Is there another question before we let the panelists respond? Okay. Go ahead, ladies. Sarah, do you want to begin or they have a mic? No? Oh, there's a mic. Sorry.
So for the relationship between alienation and writing, if I understood the question correctly, I think to me, it's rather than asking this as a sort of universal or broad question, for me what was compelling about Adnan's text was an ability to think about this experience of languaging, specifically within a post-colonial context, or what we refer to as a post-colonial context, and as post-colonial subjects. And so our relationship to language and to these, foreign languages and mother tongues, and how we live between them. And it starts with the recognition that I do, that she does, and that this is a sort of a ground for unease and alienation. But also sort of an attempt to grapple with, as a fluent speaker of colonial languages, you become somehow the embodiment of the success of the project of colonialism as, a system of indoctrination, primarily and most immediately through language. So I guess it's also grappling, so not just becoming a writer, but this specific kind of writer that is shaped by specific historical conditions and trying to describe these historical conditions. Yeah. So do you want
Thank you, Sarah. Do you want to say something about the second question?
Oh, yeah.
Pass it
So,
on.
it wasn't, so this essay is somehow was the result of different threads of thought that I've had. So my grappling with language was very separate from my grappling with motherhood. And so this is where Adnan's text becomes, motherly also for me, because it allowed me to sort of bring otherwise separate frames or threads of thought together and to sort of start thinking anew of this question that I've been grappling with. And so this figure of the mother and the question of motherhood, obviously, and one aspect of it is a very deliberate attempt to consider my personal ties to my mother as a gateway to think about my own sense of self as a woman. So to me, this became a sort of central question. And I think it also became even more important to me because we tend to center, patriarchies or father figures as we try to think about feminism. So I wanted to shift maybe the focus a little bit to the motherly and the maternal and the mother-daughter relationship. And to me, this was an opportunity to sort of take a step back from feminist theory that I had been exposed to, and find that source of theory somewhere else, and in a deeply personal place.
Thank you, Sarah. Angela.
So first, for the first question, actually what I have done is a case study. So I'm not just pointing the case of AUB, but because Angela Jordahouri was from AUB, and because AUB's mission was like that, so we have like, it matches, the mission of AUB matches with the career of the student. And yes, so it's not this concentration on the elite, but also, do we have other examples of political, I'm talking about political feminism, not only social feminism, because we have a lot of examples in the Arab world, but do we have examples of political feminism, a lot of examples in this region? So this is the women who have an access to politics, or comes of course from the elite, and the social elite or the political elite, the ones who are already experiencing this field. Yeah, so it's a cycle, and this is something that is still occurring today. So yes, and other things, could we talk about feminism in the 30s? So this is the academic field or the movement. Well, it's not something that is studied, that it's not something that is organized, and this is also something I wanted to point out with all the feminist or feminine movements in the 20s, 30s in Lebanon. We have unions, we have the Lebanese and Syrian Women Union, we have this is the biggest example, but was it something organized? Was it something ideological? No, there were just movements here and there, and there was no continuity in space or in time, and this is why we try to explain through our today's norms or today concepts, but at that time it's very difficult to talk about that. And finally, the history is written by the winners, and history is not something true. It's something that is written by someone who has maybe witnessed this period or has his own perception, but the cognitive approach is very, very important today, because it's not to contest what Charles Malik has written, but maybe to see it with a softer view. For example, Charles Malik made Lebanon as an international power in 1943. This is what we read in his writings, in his books. Lebanon is wow, okay? It's like the USA at that time. It's not true. Lebanon is a small state. And this is what we read in Angela Jordahouri's articles, for example. See, so we moderate the history, and we try to see it to a different approach, and not to bring and no, finally, what we do with this, we need to teach it. So I'm not a researcher. I'm a teacher, not even professor. So the case of Lebanon and why feminism is in crisis in Lebanon, because people do not know about women do not know about their rights. They don't know that they have duties, not only rights, and they don't know about their history. I'm teaching also the history of Lebanon, and they don't have this knowledge. Okay, because of high schools programs, etc. But I mean, there is even no curiosity. So instead, we need to bring them this knowledge, and maybe here we have this awareness they need to be, we cannot oblige them to participate to politics with the quota, etc. But they need to be aware of something, and education is the best tool.
Thank you. Yasmin?
I'm just going to briefly kind of answer each one of the questions that were raised. The first one, biographies. I mean, in this particular case, Aisha Taimur and Malak Hifni Nasif were producing these literary texts at this time that reflected not just their own voice, but they reflected what was happening in Egypt at the time. So it was also the nationalist cause and women's issues. They discussed, it reflected their own personal struggles. And this brought to the forefront a lot of the issues that women were also struggling with, other women in Egypt at the time. And so how do we know, and why is this important? Because there were reactions. There were reactions that came out in the press at the time to what these women wrote. Reactions from nationalists and reactions from Azharite and religious leaders. And this created a discourse in the media. This created a discourse on the national level that these women created through their fiction, through their prose. And this is why studying the work of this woman is important, because it is a reflection of this discourse that was created at the time that came across from this woman's work. Elitist, of course. I mean, the feminist movement in Egypt and elsewhere has constantly, look, the EFU, the Egyptian feminist movement, when it first began publishing its journal, it began publishing in French. In Egypt, and so this perception that it is begun by women of middle and upper classes is true, and this is one of the criticisms of the feminist movement. Does it necessarily mean that they are not in touch with what these women go through? Not necessarily. I mean, many of these women have been able to push for reforms, and so we shouldn't kind of rush, we should question this rush to say elitist means they are really in an ivory tower and do not reflect, because a lot of the reforms have come from these women. But this is, I think it was a year ago, did a study on women's perceptions of the feminist movement and looking at class as one of the key markers of women's identity. And this came across clearly. The women said, feminist movement, the perception is they don't know who we are, they don't feel us. And one famous quote was, they have charity balls and charity events and they go and eat with silver spoons. But this is a common perception. You're absolutely right. And finally, what's next? I mean, this is a question at the end of every kind of conference of this sort, isn't it? I mean, not just this one and not just this session. What do we do with all this knowledge that's been produced? What do we do with all of these? Ultimately, I think, and this may not necessarily answer your question, we come up with more questions often than we do with answers. But I think in this case, what I'm seeing so far in this session and others is that we are questioning certain tropes in the feminist narrative that have existed for quite a while. We're questioning certain binaries. We're seeing a great deal of diversity. And what should we do with all that? I think we should, as feminists and women that are involved in organizations, to take that back and see how they can be relevant. I mean, how do we measure the success of the feminist movement? Is it in improving the lives of these women? Is it in producing knowledge and producing research that really, creating a space that really reflects these women? Ultimately, yes. And this is hopefully what these papers and what the discussions that follow are supposed to do, I hope.
Thank you very much. I think time's up for us, so we will...
Jean, can I make an announcement?
Sure.
Please. So we're running behind on our schedule. I'm wearing my other hat now. So we're very late on schedule. So the plenary was supposed to begin at 5. It's almost 5:10 now. So we will take more time, to start. So we will not start the plenary at 5. So
when will we?
5, maybe probably try to be in Bathish around 5:20.
Is there a coffee break?
There's a coffee break now. You can grab the coffee and
wonderful research, fascinating.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your paper. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your paper. Sorry, I had to keep
No,
cutting
of
it
course.
off, but had to be done.